All right, and now Gabby, go ahead and take it away.
Awesome, thanks Blair, and thanks for everyone who has joined tonight. Good to see you all. All right, I'm gonna start sharing screen. All right, yeah, so let's get started. So like Blair said, we are going to go through a quick Trans 101 so that everyone can have the basics, and we have some common shared language when we're talking about these issues. So we are going to be talking about the constructions of the gender binary and the norms that have been created in understanding gender. And then kind of dissecting that, seeing where it maybe isn't inclusive, and then moving beyond the binary. All right, so first, I want to introduce the gender binary and some dominant societal assumptions that come with this binary. The idea here is that folks are assigned a sex at birth. So when a baby is born in the hospital, the doctor will announce whether it is a boy or a girl. And so this is what we call assigned at sex, or sex assigned at birth. The assumption here is that boys grow up to be men and girls grow up to be women. And there are traits and characteristics that are associated with these sex assigned at birth, and the track that folks are supposed to take as they move on through life. So when we are thinking about masculine and roles that masculine people are supposed to inhabit, we look at characteristics of strength, aggression, anger, being the breadwinner, taking on roles of leadership, being firefighters or into fishing, hunting, suits, ties, jeans, short hair, beards, muscles, all of that jazz. When we are looking at roles of feminine characteristics, the dominant societal assumption is that folks are supposed to be soft, pretty, emotional, motherly, the caretakers, teachers, secretaries, into shopping, cooking, sewing, long hair, makeup, earrings, etc. I guess like talking about these gender assumptions, I would ask how this makes people feel, and what sort of themes and patterns are we starting to notice as we're going through these dominant societal assumptions. So feel free to type that in the chat, but I'm going to continue. So this establishes the framework of the gender binary. And so some rules that are held with the binary is that you must be on one side or the other, but not neither or both. Your identity and behavior must be consistent and not change. So our identities are static. And sexuality expectations are also tied to this gender binary. So if someone grows up to be a man, they're supposed to be attracted to a woman, and vice versa. So this is kind of like the gender onion that we have graphic to help illustrate this a bit more. So as I mentioned, the sex assigned at birth is like where we start with the understandings of gender within this Western societal assumption. And then we move into gender identity. And so gender identity at its core is how someone feels about themselves. A good analogy we say is that if you were a robot, if your brain was placed into a robot that was anatomically the same as everyone else, you would probably still feel your gender, right? Gender is an innate sense of self and self-awareness and knowledge. Then we go into gender expression. Gender expression is how we code our genders to express it to the rest of the world and other people. And then gender perception is how folks perceive that gender. And gender perception doesn't necessarily mean gender identity for folks as well, because it could be wrapped up with a lot of those societal assumptions. The reality here is that an individual's gender exists on a spectrum. So folks could identify as a man, identify as a woman. Folks might also identify as gender queer or gender expansive beyond man or woman, genderless. There's a whole host of different gender identities that go beyond the binary and more than just two. And this can change over time. So our gender identities aren't static. As we get older, we can understand more things about ourselves, come into more self-awareness that might cause us to have a different perception of our gender. And then the key concepts of gender, sex, sexuality, and expression are all distinct and unique. So one doesn't necessarily define the other. Oops. Okay, and then so a little tool we have here is the genderbread person to help illustrate this. So as I mentioned, identity, sexual orientation or attraction, expression, and sex are all distinct and unique. And they can correlate to each other, but they also don't have to. And so this is a helpful graphic that we see in education as well, to help youth understand these concepts. So we can see here that we have like gender identity, gender expression, anatomical sex, and these are on a spectrum. So like the little, whatever the sign is, I always forget what it's called, is like no, nothingness to womanness, manness, for gender identity, gender expression, nothingness to femininity or nothing to masculinity, and so on and so forth. And so as mentioned before, identity doesn't necessarily equal expression, and that doesn't equal sex, gender, and that doesn't equal sexual orientation. So this is a helpful graphic that is used to help folks understand these concepts more. And as we can see, there's no political agenda with this, right? This isn't a tool to convert people, like it often gets misunderstood. It's more used to make sure that folks can have a better understanding of themselves and also folks around them. So that is the end of this presentation. So thank you all for letting me go through some common terms and shared understandings as we move through the rest of our presentations. And again, glad you all are here.
Awesome. Thank you, Gabby. So our next presentation is from two folks from the Multnomah County Library talking about banned books and why folks are fighting to ban them, and also LGBTQ representation. So I'll introduce both of them. Martin Malelu is the teen librarian at the Multnomah County Central Library in downtown Portland. And Sarah Ryan is Multnomah County Library's Teen Services Librarian, supporting the library's work with teens and teen-serving community partner organizations across Multnomah County. All right, Martin and Sarah, I will let you take it away.
Awesome. So I'm Martin and Sarah will be presenting with me, and we're going to talk about, like Blair said, we're going to talk about book censorship and book challenges and book bans and what that looks like and what you can do about it. All right. So just a quick overview of what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about what books are being challenged and who's challenging them. So we're going to talk about who's bringing these challenges and where they're taking them and why they're being challenged. Why are people bringing these books to different school boards? And then we're going to talk about what you can do to support all books challenged, but specifically LGBTQ to SIA plus materials, and make sure that they're in your libraries, your public libraries, and your school libraries, and that everyone can access them. So to start off, we're going to talk about the 10 most frequently challenged books of 2021. Of course, this year's data has not come out, so we can only look at 2021. I think there's going to be a lot of these on the 2022 list as well. So the top one is genderqueer. Everyone's kind of been talking about that one. We'll talk about that one a little bit more in a minute. Yeah. And then Lawn Boys, All Boys Aren't Blue. I'm not going to read all these to you, but if you take a look, you can kind of see that some of these are older and some of these are also new. So like The Bluest Eye, for example, was published in 1970. So people have been challenging books for a while. All right, let's go to this next slide. And then 5 of the 10 most frequently challenged titles in 2021 have LGBTQ plus to SIA themes. So again, genderqueer comes up all the time. I think people talk about this book so much, and I don't know how many people have actually read it, but it's banned and challenged. So just because a book is challenged doesn't necessarily mean that it's been banned. So people can bring up books to their school board or to whoever, but that doesn't mean that they're going to be challenged or they're going to be banned. So genderqueer has been restricted for queer content because it was considered to have sexually explicit images. Lawn Boy also challenged for LGBTQIA content, and it was also considered to be sexually explicit. All Boys Aren't Blue, again, sexually explicit and LGBTQIA plus content. And it just, this surprise, this book is gay, and Beyond Magenta, also LGBTQIA content. And I guess not so much sexually explicit, but it was too educational. This book is gay was. So yeah, those are the ones that people are kind of thinking about the most these days. So let's look at the next slide.
And I think this is where I am chiming in.
Yes.
Okay, cool. So this is a quote from a very recent Pan America report. The large majority of book bans underway today are not spontaneous organic expressions of citizen concern. Rather, they reflect the work of a growing number of advocacy organizations that have made demanding censorship of certain books and ideas in schools part of their mission. And I want to say that this is a link. You'll get a copy of the PDF of our slides after this. So don't worry about like remembering the places that we're pointing towards. You will have them all. And also I wanted to say, like, when books are challenged for being sexually explicit, there is very little, like, it's very vague what people actually mean by that. And it often is conflated with LGBTQ to SIA plus themes. So who is doing these challenges? As the Pan America report stated, it is mostly groups and rarely individuals motivated by an individual concern. This has really, really been on the rise. So people like political officials, Matt Krause, Governor DeSantis, Moms for Liberty is an organization that actually has a couple of chapters in Oregon. And a lot of times these groups are framing their there are challenges in terms of parental rights, but there has always been an understanding with the idea of intellectual freedom that like parents, caregivers definitely have a right to think about like what they want their kids to read, but these groups are wanting to decide what everyone gets to read and restrict what everyone gets to read. As Martin was saying earlier, the books that are challenged most frequently often have LGBTQ plus themes. So this is also from that PEN America Index of School Book Bans. And it's really telling that it is LGBTQ plus themes and protagonists or prominent secondary characters of color. So the people who are bringing these challenges forward are really attacking both LGBTQ plus themes and work by and for people of color. So yeah, that's happening. And I will turn it back to Martin to talk a little bit about what's happening in Oregon with challenges.
Yeah, so these bans, or these challenges rather, are happening in Oregon. I think a lot of times people, especially on the West Coast, can get into the mindset of this is the West Coast, like that kind of stuff doesn't happen here, right? But it totally does. So the Oregon Intellectual Freedom Clearinghouse has this report that they put out, and I've made this where it says Oregon Intellectual Freedom Clearinghouse is a link to this report. So if you want to check it out afterwards, you can click that and look at the whole entire thing. But this shows you some of the challenges that were brought to Oregon in particular. And even though this is a report of some of the challenges, there are so many that go unreported to the, like either to the American Library Association or to the people who do these infographics, right? So this doesn't represent all of the challenges that came to be, because this is only what we know about, right? So as you can see, a lot of things were challenged because they're sexually explicit. Some things were challenged because they're inaccurate. And then again, we see LGBTQIA2+, and then racism. I don't know why I'm pointing to the screen. And then racism, again, that might be because there's like this big push to get all these works by people of color challenged, right? So that might be, racism might be what they're kind of touting as that kind of thing. And then gender roles comes up on this as well. And again, this is probably not everything that has been challenged. And some of these are overlapping. So all of those things that were challenged because they were sexually explicit might also have queer content in them. And we aren't sure about that, but I think that there's a lot of overlap there. And then, so we can see here the number of challenges in Oregon. And again, the top where it says Oregon Intellectual Freedom Clearinghouse is a link to this report. Check it out. So there were 54 reports of challenges. And again, that's probably not all of them, which is up from 2021 and 2020. And that's only so far, right? And it also says that this also doesn't take into account unofficial challenges, which we will talk about a little bit later, what actually challenging a book looks like. So this is just official challenges that went through the official channels and were reported. Of the 33 materials challenge incidents reported, 16 were initiated by patrons on their own behalf, 12 by parents concerning something that affects their child, 1 by staff, and 4 by community members or groups. 25 were in public libraries, 6 in school libraries, and 2 in schools. And in 25 instances, the materials were retained, 1 they were relocated, and in 4 the materials were removed. So challenges can lead to the materials being removed, and then they become inaccessible. And while something that comes up a lot when thinking about books being challenges. Oh, you can just go buy those books and read them on your own, but they're still inaccessible to people who do not have the means to purchase those books for whatever reason.
Absolutely. And talking about inaccessible, another type of censorship that is really on the rise is what's being called soft censorship. And so that's when titles aren't purchased in the first place because of fear that they will attract controversy, that people will end up challenging them. And the graphic here is from School Library Journal's 2022 Controversial Book Survey, and it was the question, what subject matter has led you to pass on purchasing a title? And again, here we have 29% LGBTQIA plus content. And it's important to kind of see this in context, not just that all of these challenges are really hitting hard across the country. So there is kind of a climate of fear. And a lot of school libraries operate with low or zero materials budgets. There are a lot of schools that don't have school librarians. And so it's just rough. It's rough when there isn't a lot of support within the school for being able to make these kinds of materials available. And we wanted to talk a little bit, I don't think this is something that the folks listening to this probably need to be convinced of, but we really did want to talk about why these books matter. And so really the big picture is how much representation matters. And this infographic is actually part of a larger infographic that is mostly about trauma and the huge impact of trauma on queer and trans youth and protective factors that help to ameliorate disparities in health outcomes and just general well-being include family acceptance, resilience, and affirming environments. And libraries that provide these kinds of materials become really affirming environments. And these books also have just a really significant impact on individuals. And for just one specific example, back in 2019, Multnomah County Library and some other libraries actually around Oregon hosted Alex Gino, the author of Melissa, which was originally published with a different title. And if you click the link for Melissa, you'll be able to read Alex Gino explaining why they advocated with their publisher to get that title changed. And a team who participated in Alex's visit wrote about their experience. It was really meaningful to meet a non-binary author and to hear their experiences, and getting to see my own experiences as a non-binary person reflected in the things that Alex talked about, including their experiences of being misgendered and just general struggles around the gender binary. So there are many, many other examples. I was actually watching a webinar earlier today with Maya Kobe, the author of Genderqueer, talking about all of the messages they've received from youth who have been really impacted by their work by our work in a really positive way, providing language for describing feelings that youth hadn't had language for, feeling less alone. There's just a lot of really powerful, positive impact that these books can have. So I'm going to turn it back over to Martin to talk about what people can do to support these materials.
Yeah, so we can talk about all the books and all the sad things, but then there are things you can do in your community to help out everyone who lives in your community. So you can know the policies, and there are actionable steps. And then we're going to talk briefly about school boards. I think somebody else is presenting on school boards after us. So they'll probably have a little bit more information about that than we do. So let's talk about knowing the policies. So you want to know your local school board and library board members for both your home and your work locations, because both of those things are important and they might be the same. You want to work with them on policies related to public comment. Most of them have meetings, and those meetings are probably virtual or open to the public in some kind of way, or they have comments, some way that you can like submit comments for consideration. And you also want to know that no individual should be allowed to complain about materials without following the outlined reconsideration procedure. So every school board or library board, likely, I can't imagine them not having a policy on what to do if you want to challenge a book. So there are right ways to go about it, and then there are also wrong ways to go about it. So let's look at the next slide. Yeah, so a read aloud is not a formal request. So one of the big things that people are doing is they're going to these school boards or they're going to these library boards, and they're just reading passages out of these books, trying to like incite some kind of emotion out of the people on these that are sitting on these boards. But that's not a formal request. That's just kind of wasting everyone's time. So there are ways to actually like fill out paperwork and talk about why you think that this thing should be questioned or why it should be challenged in whatever way. And that doesn't get quite as much press as reading questionable material or whatever in front of a school board.
And I can jump in like super quickly. There is
Yeah.
actually a very recent challenge in Medford that the Oregon Intellectual Freedom Committee of the Oregon Library Association responded to, and I can put the letter that they prepared in the chat because it goes through a lot of like all of the things that weren't in place when that book was challenged that meant that the challenge itself really didn't have merit. So we'll put that in the chat at some point.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of strange stuff happening in Medford right now. I was looking it up around books and book challenges. So it's definitely, if you are interested in learning more, I think that's a good place to start keeping an eye out. Yeah, so you also should come prepared to correct misinformation. If you get wind that there's going to be some kind of challenge or somebody's coming to these boards and constantly pushing these issues, you can come with the right information and come with correct information, come with statistics, come with like knowledge of what's happening and the impact that these books have. And you can also formally suggest library purchases. I know most public libraries have kind of a suggest a purchase form. Your school library probably also has some kind of process for that as well. But there are formal processes for that. And you can also encourage GSAs or student organizations to vocally support materials that you think should be, or that should be in their libraries or their local, in their school libraries or their public libraries.
Absolutely. And just again, thinking about school and library board meetings and elections, showing up is just incredibly important because there are so many folks who don't want these materials to be in school libraries or public libraries, making themselves very loud. And voting in school board elections, running for school board elections. And again, we know that there is going to be more about that, but we wanted to include this in our section as well. And some of this information actually came from a webinar that you can watch if you click that link, Empower Your Library Against Book Bans. It's kind of designed for library professionals, but members of the public can get a lot from it as well. And we'll finish it up with a few different toolkits that you can use to get just really like a lot of in-depth information about like being active against book challenges, help that you can have when you are learning about maybe book challenges that are happening in your area. So the National Coalition Against Censorship, there's a organization called Every Library that is basically like a organization that helps libraries around the country get support. And then Book Riot, which is a site that has been doing a lot of tracking of challenges and censorship around the country. They have a really great article. And then American Library Association and others have a toolkit, Unite Against Book Bans. All of those, again, you will be able to click when you get the PDF. And I believe that's it. And I guess we're going to have a Q&A at the end, so maybe no questions now, but we'll have questions when there's the Q&A for everybody.
Awesome. Thank you both, Sarah and Martin. I know a couple other folks joined us during that presentation, so I just wanted to highlight that if you have questions about any of the things that come up this evening, you could text 412-780-4582, and then we'll be going over some of those after the presentations. I also wanted to note, because there were a lot of great links provided in that presentation, that tomorrow we will be sending out an email to all the folks who showed up tonight with that, as well as some other great links from other panelists. So don't worry if you missed any of the links, you'll be getting them. So now I'm going to turn things over to our next speaker, Austin Lee, who uses, they, them pronouns. They work as an education and training program coordinator and gender affirming care lead at Planned Parenthood Columbia-Willamette. Austin believes that all people deserve access to comprehensive LGBTQ2SIA+ inclusive and disability inclusive sex ed. They bring 18 years of sex ed teaching experience to their sex ed workshops and their professional development trainings for educators, counselors, and youth program staff. All right, and I will hand it over to you, Austin.
Thank you, Blair. Also, thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Martin, for that really great rundown. And, you know, I see so many connections when we're talking about banning books and when we're talking about curriculum around sexual health education. There are a lot of community organizations and groups that are pushing back at the school board level and the individual school level. And so today we're going to talk a little bit about what comprehensive and LGBTQ plus inclusive sex ed actually looks like. We'll talk a little bit about the vision for what we'd like to see in our community so that all folks have the health information they need, and then talk a bit about ways that we can engage with folks to handle some of the misinformation, the disinformation that we might be hearing in the community. And I'm really glad that we have folks to talk about the school board work too, because that's so important. So I'm going to share my screen for some slides so we have something to look at while I talk with y'all tonight. Since we're going to be talking about comprehensive and LGBTQ plus inclusive sex ed, it's probably good to start at some definitions. Those are big words, and things have changed a lot since many of us were in school. So what does it mean to have sex ed be comprehensive? So at a basic level, that means that it offers all of the info that's required by our Oregon State health standards, and that information is presented in an age-appropriate topics progress, right? So we're seeing it build on itself, and it starts in early grades in age-appropriate ways, and then it goes into middle school and into high school, developing throughout that time in more developmentally appropriate ways. It also doesn't leave out or give inaccurate information. And that's really important because previously, and in some places still, folks do leave out entire swaths of information that are important for young people to know how to care for their health, both now and in the future. So when we talk about comprehensive sex ed, those curricula tend to typically include discussions about bodily autonomy and consent, and that might start at really early grades in really basic ways about this is my body, I get to decide when I want to hug, when I don't want to hug. And then those consent and autonomy conversations continue into middle school and high school, talking about dating and sexual relationships. We also see relationship education and abuse prevention education. And so that's going to look like what are traits of healthy, unhealthy, and abusive relationships? What are some resources for people who need help for themselves or for someone else if they're experiencing unhealthy or abusive things in a relationship? Talking about sexual behaviors. And again, this is going to be age and developmentally appropriate information. So when we're talking about sexual behaviors, that typically isn't starting until 8th grade. And it's really framed around talking about how pregnancy happens in the body. What are sexually transmitted infections and HIV and how do they spread? So necessarily, we need to explain what sexual behaviors are and what types of risks each behavior can carry. And then we're also going to be talking in age-appropriate ways about prevention strategies for pregnancy, STIs, and HIV. So that looks like talking about the full gamut of abstinence, which means not having sex, talking about using condoms and other barrier methods, contraceptives or birth control, and emergency contraceptives. Talking about fertility tracking and the withdrawal method, because those are strategies that many people, many families use or teach young people to use. And talking about HIV prevention medications, including PrEP and PEP. So we're really thinking about giving young people access to all the tools, all the information of all the tools that they might want to use now or in the future to care for their health. And so part of that is also educating young folks about how to access care. So again, thinking more in the high school age, we're really talking about how someone can access STI and HIV testing, how to access birth control. What does it look like to have one of those doctor's appointments? So we're really trying to get a comprehensive, well-rounded set of information out to young people, and that it's going to grow throughout the elementary, middle, and high school years in ways that are appropriate to the developmental tasks that are happening for those young folks. So then, that's what comprehensive means. So when we layer on LGBTQ inclusive, what does that actually look like? So the three main things I think of is that one, it's going to address the needs and the realities of LGBTQ plus students. There are specific health needs, relationship health needs, particular questions or considerations about confidentiality in the medical care world that they might have, and we need to be addressing those. Again, it looks like age-appropriate topics. So again, starting in elementary school with just sort of a basic understanding of what different identities are, of being inclusive of those people, being kind to those people, to all people. And then as we move forward into 8th grade, into 9th grade, when we're having more sexual health conversations, really trying to think about incorporating specific lenses for inclusion on LGBTQ people and their needs. And so that can take a variety of sort of different forms in sex ed classes. Some things that the LGBTQ inclusive curricula tend to do are first just acknowledging LGBTQ plus people and intersex people. That is left out of some curricula entirely. And then making sure that the language we're using is going to be inclusive and accessible for all people. So things like saying people of all genders. We can say things like boys or girls or groups of boys and girls when we're talking about those gender specific things. But there are many things like people of all genders go through puberty. Everyone goes through puberty. So we don't need to just say boys and girls. We can talk about the person that someone's dating rather than always relying on boyfriend or girlfriend. Or we can talk about body parts as the key factor rather than gender when that's what's happening. So things like people with uteruses can get pregnant. That's the truth. Some folks who are women have uteruses, some don't. So if we say women, we're really not actually giving the right information. And so we want to be inclusive, but also really clear that pregnancy is about having a uterus. It's one of the things that's needed for pregnancy. Also, when we're thinking about older grades, thinking about dating, thinking about teen relationships, but also adult relationships, we want to acknowledge the role of gender and sexual orientation within relationship violence or within relationship health. Talking specifically about things like if someone is threatening to out their partner to their employer or to their family or to other friends, that's actually relationship violence. That's not a healthy relationship tactic that's happening. And so also thinking about actively addressing and combating stigma against LGBTQ plus people, but also the stigma around things like HIV and some of the old ideas of HIV being something that is only a gay man's issue, right? When we know that's not true. So we're looking at really helping LGBTQ plus people see themselves in the curriculum, right? See themselves in the curriculum explicitly through, you know, queer and trans people being used in the scenarios that are being presented, but also having an open conversation about how gender and sexuality can impact our lives and what are the resources that each of us need to care for ourselves. So that's a lot of information. I'm an educator, so I'm used to talking with people and asking questions. It's a little strange for me just to talk with folks. You know, the vision that I want to put out there, and when we're talking to people, we want to kind of oftentimes keep things pretty direct, and we want to talk about what is the real need, what is the positive impact of having comprehensive and LGBTQ inclusive sex ed? Why do we need this? Well, so the reality is that all youth deserve and need sex ed that is going to be relevant to them, to their needs and to their experiences. That's true for youth with disabilities. It's true of queer and trans youth. It's true of all youth. And so I think we can probably all agree on that here, right? That all youth deserve access to this info. And that if sex ed is not inclusive of LGBTQ plus folks in particular, then those youth don't get the tools that they need to care for their health. And that's going to continue to perpetuate the health disparities that we see in those communities. And it's really just not fair and doing a disservice to those young people. Also, as a piece of this, we don't know who's going to identify as LGBTQ in the future. So if we make an assumption that, right, that everyone is cisgender in their class at whatever grade level, or everyone is straight within the class, right, then we're probably getting that wrong some of the time. So the vision that I have is that, you know, when we teach a curriculum that really is inclusive of the broadest range of all the youth in the class, then all of the youth are going to benefit from that conversation. There are going to be youth in the class who are practicing abstinence, who maybe are not interested in having sex at all, or are asexual, and the information can still be relevant to them as they become helpers for their peers and for their community members who didn't have access to that information. And we really want to think about being inclusive of LGBTQ folks, but also folks with disabilities, folks with limited English, so that everyone in the class gets to be part of a community where we have this health information we can carry forward. And so within the work, at the school district level, within the community conversation level, there have been a lot of myths and a lot of misinformation that's been put out there. And I want to take a little bit of time to address some of those myths and to talk about how to engage with some of that misinformation that we might be coming across. So I want to go over 3 sort of core myths that I hear a lot about when we hear about LGBTQ inclusive sex ed in particular. And so those myths I want to talk about are this concern or idea that teaching about sex and sexual health is going to promote sex. Another is that this myth that that they're seeing something inappropriate, that there's something pornographic about what is being shown or taught. And then the last is that this is somehow related to something called grooming, which is an activity that is designed for an adult to be able to take advantage of a youth sexually. And so I want to really talk about those and dismantle those together. And the first thing when I think about addressing these myths and this misinformation is so much of what we're talking about is about storytelling and making connections with people. Right? There are people in our lives and in our communities who we can talk with and we can have good connections and conversations with, where we can persuade them to see things from our perspective and maybe reconsider some of the actions they're taking or the words they're using that are actually ending up harming people. So thinking about telling stories about ourselves, about our lives, maybe with permission from our young people in our lives, telling stories about their needs or their experiences, and trying to really connect that person with the reality that we inhabit. So first of all, thinking about sex ed as the myth of it promoting sex. That has been talked about for a long time. And over many years of research, we have lots of data to show us that actually that is not true. Teaching sex ed actually conversely is shown to help young people postpone having sex. So they're having sex at a later age. And that when they do choose to have sex, they're more likely to use a condom, to use birth control. And so, sex ed is not a how-to guide. It's not teaching people to have sex or how to have sex. It's really teaching people how to take care of their health if that is something they choose to do. So talking with folks about why that information feels important to you and why young people knowing how to take care of themselves and their bodies and their relationships is really important. That's something that's going to maybe connect with people and help them see things from a different perspective. Also, just to put it out there, comprehensive sex ed has lots of other great benefits. It decreases the likelihood of dating violence and sexual violence. It is shown to prevent childhood sexual abuse and to reduce rates of unintended pregnancy, rates of STIs and HIV, and actually to improve overall academic success, right? So there's lots of great things that happen when we're teaching good sex ed and when youth have access to this information. And so one of the ways that I like to make a connection with folks is to think about sharing facts with people, right? So I just gave you some facts, right? The comprehensive sex ed, in fact, doesn't promote sex. It tends to have young people delay having sex and make different choices to take care of their health, right? Using condoms, using birth control when they do choose to have sex. And so a way that I often will share things like that is to really kind of step into some humility, right? Yeah, I used to think that too, or I'd heard that too. And then I learned about this and that changed how I saw it, right? So we're taking someone along in that journey with us. Like, yeah, I used to hear that too. And now I see it a little differently. There's also an assumption out there or an idea out there that schools are showing things that are pornographic or that are sexually explicit to students. So sex ed is designed to provide health information, not to show those things, not to give that kind of information. And so when we're talking with folks in our lives about this, I think really just sharing what I was sharing earlier, right? Yeah, it is going to talk about what sex is because young people need to know how pregnancy happens. They need to know how STIs and HIV get transmitted so that they can know how to take care of their health, right? And that just talking about those things and saying what sex is itself is not pornographic or inappropriate. And some folks might have heard things that are really scary. And so coming alongside of them and just, asking some questions that are really like rooted in connection with people can be really helpful. So yeah, what are the things that you're hearing about that are concerning you, right? And then trying to see if we can find out what is the real information. Most school districts are going to make their curriculum available to people in the district. So you can go view that curriculum, you can go read through that curriculum. If that person has a youth in school, they could be talking with the teacher of that young person to talk about what is being taught if they have a concern about that. And I think also when we're thinking about our family members and our loved ones who might be sort of fence sitters, they're not sure how they feel about this, helping them understand that, the reason that we teach about, what sex is, we define what oral sex is, what anal sex is, what vaginal sex is because young people might get misinformation from the internet, from their peers. And wouldn't we rather have them get the correct information and know how to take care of their health now or in the future too? So the last piece I'll say is about this myth about grooming, that it's a really deeply homophobic and transphobic myth, that this is about LGBTQ people having efforts towards grooming children. That is really, it's really offensive actually, and it's untrue and it's damaging. And So a lot of what we're teaching young folks when we teach sex ed is about bodily autonomy. It's about consent. It's about resources for when something is happening that makes us uncomfortable, or when we need to take care of our health. And those are all things that are shown to actually be protective factors for young people when it comes to things like sexual abuse or sexual grooming. And, you know, I think it's important when these things come up to acknowledge that that's often rooted in people's misunderstanding, fear, and maybe even hatred for LGBTQ folks. So when we hear these myths, I think it's really good to counter that quickly with knowledge, right? So actually, like, teaching youth about consent and about their bodies is a protective factor. It actually helps prevent abuse. It lets young people know how to take care of their bodies and what to do if something's happening that's inappropriate or that they don't like. Also pushing back on the myths about the sort of social contagion element of this, right? There are times to really just call it out and say, actually, this is rooted in a lot of anti-gay or anti-trans stereotypes. And like, let's not engage with those stereotypes. Let's talk about what's really happening. We're teaching about bodies. We're teaching about consent. That can be uncomfortable, but it's really important information. And I also think that adults have a really important role in the lives of their children or the children they're caring for to be a part of these conversations. So I think of these conversations in schools as a yes and for the young people, right? They're learning a lot at school, and then the adults and the caregivers at home can be the people that help them understand it, unpack it, and think about how the values that their family has applies to this information that they're getting. With that, I will say thank you so much, and I would love any questions later on down the road. Thanks, Blair.
Thank you so much, Austin. That was super informative. And yes, please go ahead and send your questions to the number we've got in the chat for Austin or any other panelists. I am going to now once again hand things over to Gabby Gardner, who will now be talking about how to get involved, with school policies at your local level.
Thanks, Blair. And gosh, these have been some great presentations today, so thank you all so much. All right. Okay, so we are going to be talking about school boards now. And I think as an organizer, it's really important to identify decision makers and people who hold the power to allocate funds, make decisions on policies or enforce policies, because these are often the people in power that we need to encourage when they're doing the right thing, and we need to hold them accountable when they are not doing the right thing and are not reflecting our values in our communities. So we're going to be talking about school boards, which are local positions. There is about 199 local school boards, so you could see why it is very complicated and very difficult for community members and organizers to coordinate efforts, especially on a statewide level, because there is so much uniqueness to each school board, and there's also just so many of them, right? But a school board member position can often be looked at as something that isn't as important as like a statewide elected office position or a district level position, or like top of the ticket positions like, governor, secretary of state. But these people actually have a lot of decision-making power. So first I want to go over what a school board does to kind of illustrate this. So they review, create, and maintain school policies. So they are kind of like the executives of a school functioning. They're the folks who will push policies on a local level, They're also folks who maintain and uphold statewide policies that have been passed to be enforced at the local level for each school district, or they might go against those, which we will talk about a little bit later. They also hold a really important role in managing the administration within each school district, particularly the superintendent. So they are kind of like the hiring committee, and they evaluate how the superintendent is doing at their job, and then they also have firing power too. They also establish a budget. So they're the ones who are deciding where the funds go for the school, which is really important. They also ask voters to approve bond measures and local option levies for school facilities and operations. And they guide the collective bargaining discussions within school unions for teachers. So as we can see, they're actually very important and vital to the school's functioning and operations. So over the last 2 years, the reason why school boards have become such a hot topic is because we are seeing very coordinated and devastating attacks within school board members who are taking office and hold very transphobic, homophobic, and racist views, as well as organizations that are putting in tons of money, hundreds of thousands of dollars to coordinate efforts to pressure school boards into certain decisions. So some examples that we've seen over the past 2 years was this. I think the big start was Newburgh. We saw that they banned Pride and Black Lives Matter flags within the school district. In Grants Pass, the I Resolve campaign with 2 educators to regulate bathroom usage based on assigned sex. Book bans, as we saw Sarah and Martin refer to, protesting inclusive sex ed curriculums, firing superintendents when they don't feel that the policies are being enforced to the degree that they would like. So a really big public fire that happened was in Newburgh because they felt that the current superintendent at the time was not enforcing the Pride flag ban adequately. And this was obviously a very difficult policy to enforce because folks who were skeptical and not in favor of the ban kind of said that it was a loose end policy. Maybe it might be a pride flag ban, but what if there is signage that just has pink, blue, and white on the poster or the sign? Are we going to ban that too because that is in coordination with the trans flag? So we can see that the rabbit hole was very difficult for administration to enforce, and unfortunately that led to a firing of a superintendent, which also is really costly for the district because they need to spend tens of thousands of dollars to form a search committee and hire a new superintendent, as well as pay the severance package of a year for the superintendent who was fired. We are seeing board members of color and LGBTQI2S+ board members who are being harassed. We've seen this multiple times. There is resignations that happen because of this, because when board members are holding these identities, it puts a target on their back. And we are also seeing these statewide policies that are being blatantly disregarded or not followed. So the ODE, the Oregon Department of Education, has guidelines that were established to support LGBTQ2SI plus students and individuals. And a lot of those guidelines are being actively pushed against or not enforced in school districts. And then we also see school districts who are like the Menstrual Dignity Act that was passed in 2021, I believe, HB 3294, I'm pretty sure, to provide menstrual products in all public school restrooms. We're seeing schools like Newburgh who are not following that policy and not supplying that for men's restrooms, which we know that menstruation is not regulated to gender. So our response over the past few years has been supporting recall campaign efforts for problematic board members in Newburgh. We've been supporting a coalition called the I Affirm Coalition and Grants Pass to help respond to the I Resolve movement, and then also support them with greater visions for LGBTQS2IS+ student inclusion. And then as we are moving, we oftentimes have things come up, sometimes with really short notice, 72 hours or less, hearing about a coordinated attack at a school board meeting to ban an inclusive sex ed curriculum policy or not let it pass. And we'll see groups like Parents' Rights and Education and Moms United turn out dozens of people to these board meetings. So we have to respond and try to match that energy and get people who are in support of trans and gender diverse students to those board meetings to give public comment. And so, like I said, it's a really quick turnaround oftentimes. And we've had to have been very reactive in our organizing over these past few months. So it basically looks like something that's happening at a board meeting, we need to turn out 20 to 30 people, and then we just kind of sit until we see the next thing pop up. And that could be within the same district or a completely different district. So we might have something happen in North Clackamas and then move right into Westland, Wilsonville a week or two later. So I think that the long-term conversations is that there's kind of two approaches we need to maintain with this. First is continuing the reactive drumbeat, because we're seeing conservatives and these organizations maintain this level of attacks on school boards, and they're very consistent and they have a very strong base of people. So we need to create and maintain our strong base of people to keep in that reactive frame, while also thinking about long-term strategies to be more proactive on dealing with the board, the school board issue. So I think that the call here is having people ready to show up to a board meeting with testimony and visibility aids to support trans and gender diverse students, and the policies that are being put in place to help create a better educational experience for these students. And so if there is a school district that you live nearby or that is close to your work that is having something happening, we'll probably hit you up and say, hey, we really need someone, some folks to come out to this board meeting. And folks will get the opportunity to testify. This can be around 2 to 5 minutes, depending on how many people are in attendance. I, as a staff member, and other bro member or staff members are definitely here to help craft messaging for that testimony. Involvement on a local level with the school board races, including identifying progressive candidates, looking at candidate platforms and what they're talking about and what they support and where they're getting money from, if so, and being involved with civic engagement and actually turning out to vote. So, these elections aren't like the sexy elections, right? It's not like the governor's race, but as mentioned before, these are still very important positions. So we should be making sure that we're looking at all the candidates who are running and who reflect our values of inclusion and equity in education, and turning out to vote for these members or these candidates, as well as, building the base of support to help other folks turn out for them as well. And if compelled, run for a seat. I think that being involved in civic engagement doesn't necessarily just have to be voting. If you are someone who is really invested in education for our youth, and there is a lot of things that you think we should be doing within those school districts that would be better, or helping enforce policies that currently exist, then, we got your back. And also being involved with our statewide elections for the November election. So the school board races are something that long-term we'll be talking about within 2023. So there's definitely more to come on that. But in the short term right now, we have the November general election coming up. And the governor's race particularly is really important. So far, we're seeing 2 of the 3 major candidates who have verbally stated that they would want to ban trans girls from participating in sports. So we need to make sure that we are thinking about top of the ticket to the governor's race and supporting Tina Kotek, who's our endorsed candidate with Bro. And looking at our district races and trying to make sure that we have progressive candidates who are being elected within the Senate and House, to make sure that those bigger seats have folks that will support our work in the long term as well. There is the State Board of Education that has 13 members, and the governor has the power to appoint those members. So that is really important to keep in mind. And we are going to be having a kickoff event that I'll plug for next Wednesday from 5 to 7 in Northeast Portland. So if that's close to your area and you're able to attend, then I will drop the link to sign up for that, and you can help us with trying to get a good governor in office. And then, like I mentioned, the discussion of school board races and what that looks like is going to be formulated, and we're kind of in the process over the next few months of identifying candidates who would want to run, and making sure that we can get them into office in 2023, as well as support them when they are in office too, for retention. So I'll drop that link in the chat now, but that is the end of this presentation. So I will pass it back to Blair to close us up for the night.
Awesome. Thank you, Gabby. And as you were talking, I think made me think of one other point I would add on to your excellent presentation, which is that really, we simply don't have the capacity, right, to stay on top of, I think you said 199 school boards. We can't look at all those agendas and watch those videos. So really, we rely on community members in those areas to be our eyes and ears. So, if you catch word of something, some sort of controversy, some sort of anti-LGBTQ sentiment happening in your local area, let us know, and we can help you figure out how to get, a good turnout at the next school board meeting to help combat that sentiment. Really always like hearing from folks, especially outside of the Portland metro area. So let's see, it is now time for our Q&A portion. So I've got a couple questions here. I wanted to start it off with a question that I think can go to all of our panelists, and that is, how do you find it best to approach talking to people who might be on the fence about some of these issues, right? Who maybe have heard kind of differing opinions about comprehensive sex ed and aren't sure what they want for their kid, or have heard kind of the worst about books like Genderqueer and are unsure, even though they're not necessarily super transphobic, whether they want their kid reading it. I'm wondering kind of what the best tactics are in those types of conversations. And anyone feel free to jump in from the panel.
Well, I think actually the strategies that Austin shared during their presentation about the storytelling and making connections are really great. We're thinking about like correcting misinformation. If somebody has maybe seen something that's like really out of context, providing more information about, like, for instance, some of the books that we talked about, they're graphic novels. They're like books that have pictures in them, and those are very apt to be challenged because you can take one picture and you can think like, ooh, this is, and understanding that like you need to know the whole context. You need to know really kind of what is trying to be done with a particular book, and to, again, just Austin had great great strategies, so I will maybe let them also chime in.
Thanks, Sarah. Yeah, I also think about, you know, I talk with families and parents a lot about that these conversations that are happening in schools or in your faith community or wherever are also really great door openers for you, right? Because you don't have to be the source of every piece of knowledge. You get to come in and say, what did you learn? What did you think about that? How would that feel learning about that? What kind of questions come up for you about this, right? So that you get to play that role with the young person in your life rather than having to have all the information to deliver it directly yourself. So in a way, kind of leaning into that, right? And that if it was uncomfortable for that young person, like be in that discomfort and talk with them about it. If it was exciting, then hear it was exciting and help them figure out, you know, what they want to do with the information they received.
Excellent. Thank you both. And another question that came up, I think this is particularly sort of pointed to Gabby, but I think other folks can chime in as well. Do you have any tips for people who haven't ever like delivered a public comment at a public meeting before? Often school board meetings, especially when these topics come up, can be kind of intimidating and you don't get a lot of time. So I wonder if you have tips for how to prepare.
Yeah, I think so like the basic template that I use for helping either craft my own testimony or supporting people for their testimony is to first just take it in like a few parts. So introduction, context of the issue, and then a personal story or some supplemented facts that folks want to include in that. The introduction is important so that they obviously know who you are, but then it's also important to identify if you are a member of that district or a member of that community, because that can have some extra weight when you're testifying towards people who are decision makers. Because I think it's important, especially for people who are nervous to talk to decision makers, to remember that you're the one who elects them. So you have the power over them to either keep them in office or get them out. So to establish that, I think is a really important framework. And then the personal story element, I think, is really important as well, because we don't need to approach a testimony as like being like an expert in academia or like having like all of these certifications, because we're an expert in our own experience, right? And I think that our personal stories have a lot to say about how we're experiencing education, how we're experiencing things in our community, and what is going well and what can be better. I think the final thing too I'll say is that I totally understand the nervousness around having like a 5-minute testimony planned out, and then a bunch of people turn out and the decision makers are like, you only have 1 minute now for public comment. And that can be really stressful. So I think having just the bare bones, like what is like the main 2 or 3 things that you want to drive home with your testimony is really important. And then finally, I would say ending on that direct ask. So what is the thing that you want that decision-making body to do? And making sure that you state that like throughout the testimony. So those are some of the elements I think that can be helpful.
And I want to chime in on this too, because one of the things that we've seen in work that's happening specifically around combating book challenges and bans is that some of the most powerful people speaking out are youth. And so youth who can speak specifically about what these materials can provide for them, and what damage it does to not be able to have that access. Youth are really like can be such powerful speakers and self-advocates, it's really, it can be like extra intimidating to talk to a room full of adults, but like youth who have great adult support can make such a huge impact. And also one thing that it was actually, again, Austin's presentation that made me think of it. The example that we used was about the impact of seeing a non-binary author on a non-binary team, but it's also really important to recognize how much value it has for people who are not anywhere under, the LGBTQIA2S plus umbrella to read these stories, to be able to make these connections, and that's also just in terms of like developing empathy and respect and understanding. That's a really huge reason to have these materials as well. Just wanted to throw that in.
Thank you both. That was super insightful. And we just got a follow-up question texted in. This person wants to know, is it beneficial to attend school board meetings even if you don't want to provide a statement? Is there an upside just in having supportive people present? I'm seeing some nods. Yeah, I can kind of chime in on this one too. I think having gone to many public meetings, folks who are there just to hold up signs, or if it's allowed, to applaud after a comment, I think definitely help. You're helping improve the morale of the folks who are commenting so that they don't feel alone, and you're just sending a message to anyone there or anyone watching the meeting at home that there are more people in your community that support queer and trans folks. Would any panelists want to add anything there?
You may not want to give a comment this time, but you may go and decide, you know what, I had something to say and I'm going to go back next month or next week, and I'm going to share that comment this time, and I'm going to bring my neighbor with me. So you never know what excitement. Also, you might see some people there who you didn't know were allies, or see some folks there that you can connect with outside of that space too.
Yeah, that's a great point. Thank you. Well, I think we're about ready to wrap things up, but I wanted to end just with one question I had for fellow panelists. I think, as queer and trans folks, or as people who, are parents or have loved ones of queer and trans folks, I think doing this work, whether it's professionally or on a, volunteer community member basis, can sometimes be really hard. It can be really demoralizing to hear language like rumors thrown around, or to feel like it's such an uphill battle just to educate our neighbors. What are some things that really help fill your cup and help you keep wanting to do this work?
I feel like I'm like not following the step up, step back, guideline by talking too much. But I mean, the first thing that occurs to me is community, is just being able to have other people who kind of understand like what's going on and can be sounding boards and support, and just, to not feel alone.
I think that this work saves lives. Like, that's pretty dramatic, but like it really does. And there's been testimonies before where folks have, shared stories at these board meetings about feeling that isolation and the impacts of that isolation. And I mean, echoing Sarah, I think finding community was a really important part of the journey. And I think that it is very empowering as like a queer and trans individual to have been that person who felt very isolated and felt very powerless and didn't know how to navigate systems within a school system or within like elected politics, and to have people bring me in and elevate and like affirm to me that my voice was important and that my experiences weren't unique to myself, and there was people who shared some of those experiences, and that, you know, that led me to like talking in front of the governor and like being like, you need to do more for survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault. Like that, you know, that was a really empowering experience. And I think that that's what like keeps this work going, is that community building piece and that empowering piece, because I think that there's a lot from that rhetoric, the problematic rhetoric that makes folks feel, or made me at least feel powerless and hopeless, until I found folks who kind of challenge that narrative. And yeah.
I'd say thinking about how much better things have gotten in our lifetimes, however long our lifetime is, we've probably seen some improvement. And if you want some inspiration, connect with some young queer people, you know, like hear what they have to say. It's really inspiring. And it's, you know, the more we can support them in creating the world that they want to see, right? Maybe we haven't had a chance to do it for ourselves, we have a chance to do it for and with them.
Excellent. Thank you. Well, if there's no other thoughts, I think it's just about time to wrap up. I want to thank everyone, our amazing panelists, and all the viewers who showed up and submitted questions. Very much appreciated. Just a reminder, this recording will be on YouTube sometime in the next week, so you can share with your friends and community members. And tomorrow we'll also be sending out an email to you all with all of the links mentioned tonight, as well as some additional ones. So thank you all. I hope you all have a great evening. Take care.